Good evening. Thank you for joining us. My name is Michael Gerard. I teach environmental law, energy law, and climate change law, and direct the Center for Climate Change Law here at Columbia Law School. The center analyzes and develops legal resources and techniques to fight climate change and to reduce its impacts. If any of you are interested in learning more about what we do, in being added to our mailing list, or in following our very active blog, you can go to www.columbiaclimatelaw.com. Our next major event is on May 23. That is our biannual EPA Region 2 conference, which is co-sponsored by EPA Region 2 and the American, New York State, New York City, and New Jersey Bar Association. So we'll be sending out more information, but that's May 23 if you want to hold that on your calendars. Columbia Law School and the Center for Climate Change Law are happy to present this forum on the future of the Indian Point Nuclear Power Plant, together with our co-sponsors, the Earth Institute of Columbia University, the New York State Bar Association's section on environmental law, the Environmental Law and Energy Committees of the New York City Bar Association, and the New York League of Conservation Voters. I also want to thank Kevin Healy for his help in organizing this program. In order to reach as broad an audience as possible, a video of this program will be posted on our website. Again, that's www.columbiaclimatelaw.com. First, a word about our format tonight. I'll introduce our panelists, each of whom will speak for roughly 15 minutes. Then each of them will have 5 minutes to respond. I'll then ask them some questions to spark further discussion. We will then have questions from the audience. We've left cards on the desks, and if you have a question, please write it on the card and pass it to the people who are going to be passing up and down the aisles after the major presentations a little later. We will adjourn at 8:30. Before introducing our distinguished panelists, I wanted to give some background. We're here this evening, as you know, to discuss the controversy concerning whether the Indian Point Nuclear Power Plant should be granted a 20-year license renewal sought by its owners and operators, Entergy Corporation. Indian Point Energy Center is located in Buchanan, New York, in Westchester County, roughly 30 miles north of New York City. The plant includes 2 operating pressurized water reactors, designated Indian Point 2 and Indian Point 3, which Entergy bought from Consolidated Edison and the New York Power Authority, respectively. The facility also contains the Indian Point 1 reactor, which was granted an operating license in 1962 and permanently taken out of commission in 1974. Indian Point is one of 6 operating nuclear power plants in New York State and accounts for 40% of the state's net nuclear generation. According to the Energy Information Administration, New York is one of the top 5 states in terms of nuclear capacity and generation. Nuclear power produces nearly 30% of the state's electricity. The Indian Point nuclear reactors are 2 of 104 nuclear reactors operating in 65 plants around the nation. Of these 104 reactors, 71 reactors have been granted 20-year license extensions, and 15 reactors, including Indian Point 2 and 3, have filed for license renewal. Nuclear energy generated about 20% of the United States electricity and 14% of the world's electricity in 2010. But the case for widespread U.S. nuclear plant construction has eroded due to lower natural gas prices, slow electricity demand growth in a weak U.S. economy, lack of financing, and uncertainty following the Fukushima disaster of March 2011. Since the accident at the 3 Mile Island plant in Pennsylvania in 1979, no new nuclear power plants had been licensed in the United States until just last month. But on February 9th, 2012, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission voted 4-1 to allow the Southern Company to build and operate 2 new nuclear reactors at its existing Vogtle nuclear power plant in Georgia. Here in New York, the Indian Point plant has provided a significant source of power to New York City and its northern suburbs since its 2 active reactors went into operation in 1974 and 1976. Indian Point 2 and 3 have a summer generating capacity of 2,065 megawatts combined and contribute up to 30% of the power of New York City and Westchester, depending on the time of year and which other plants are operating. Indian Point is currently the subject of separate federal and state legal proceedings, which have been underway for several years. At the state level, the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, DEC, issued a new draft Clean Water Act permit in 2003 that essentially required Entergy to retrofit the reactors from a once-through cooling water intake system to a closed-loop system to minimize the impact its operation has on the Hudson River ecosystems. Entergy challenged the draft permit and requested a hearing. In April 2010, DEC denied Entergy's application for a state water quality certification based on its findings that Indian Point's operations violated state water quality standards, including those that protect the Hudson River's fish populations. Entergy requested a hearing to challenge the denial, and Riverkeeper intervened in support of the state. The state hearing began in October 2011 and will continue through 2012 with a decision from DEC whether to uphold or reverse the denial, not likely until 2013. At the federal level, Entergy applied for a 20-year license renewal from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in 2007. The Indian Point 2 and Indian Point 3 licenses expire in 2013 and 2015, respectively. New York State, the Connecticut Attorney General, Riverkeeper, and other groups intervened in opposition to the relicensing. The NRC hearing will begin in the summer or fall of this year. All told, the NRC administrative law judges will hold 16 separate legal and factual issues, will hear 16 separate legal and factual issues challenging the relicensing, dealing with both safety and environmental issues. The issues range from leaking buried pipes and metal fatigue of reactor components to contamination of the Hudson River from radioactive waste leaks and the plant's impacts on endangered species. However, under the NRC regulations, issues relating to nuclear waste storage, evacuation and emergency planning, seismic hazards, and terrorism are specifically excluded from review and cannot be raised by the interveners. The hearing will proceed for 1 to 2 months with an initial decision possible in late 2012 or early 2013. Among the plant's opponents is New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, who has called for the plant to be shut down permanently. Mayor Bloomberg, on the other hand, has backed the relicensing, arguing that the plant is essential to the economic viability of the area and that without the power that Indian Point supplies, New York and the surrounding areas could face shortages and blackouts with replacement sources of energy years down the road. So I'm now going to call on our first speaker, who is Paul Gallais. Paul is an attorney, educator, and nonprofit executive working to protect community character and improve environmental sustainability. After a brief stint in private practice, Paul served for 12 years in the New York State Attorney General's Environmental Protection Bureau and at the State Department of Environmental Conservation. After leaving public service, Paul spent over a decade as an executive in the land conservation movement in New York and Maine. Now, as president of Riverkeeper, Paul fights for a cleaner Hudson and safer drinking water for over 9 million New Yorkers. Paul received degrees from Williams College and Columbia Law School, and he was a visiting professor of environmental studies at Williams from 2004 to 2007. Paul lives in Ossining, New York. Paul.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you. As Mike said, I'm a graduate of the law school, and so it's particularly interesting to be on this side of the table for once. I'll try to handle it responsibly, and those of you who are students, I certainly won't call on anybody. I also was a regulator in government for a dozen years, and so I take my responsibilities to the regulatory process very seriously. And even though this is an issue where there's a great deal at stake and a lot of emotional charge, I'm not going to be as emotional as some of you would like me to be, or as emotional as some of you would fear that I will be. I will try to focus on the facts as I know them, because the facts are what count here. First, we have to consider the potential impacts of an accident at Indian Point. Now, we and the Natural Resources Defense Council have studied what would happen if you had a Fukushima-level accident at Indian Point. And the answer is that 5.6 million people would have to either shelter in place or evacuate. That an area from the plant down to the George Washington Bridge would become uninhabitable for generation upon generation. If you had a Chernobyl-style accident, you'd have a 7% increase in the cancer rate within the 50-mile zone, and you can just imagine how many cancers that would be, since there's 18 million people living within that zone. And an area down to the end of Manhattan would become uninhabitable. So the stakes are high. No one would dispute that. The risks are real. When you couple real risks with stakes that high, you understand why Riverkeeper is advocating for closure of the plant. I'm going to start with a question of seismic risk. And again, I'm going to start off with the presumption in the 1960s that the worst earthquake we'd probably see was a 3.0 on the Richter scale. Now, every time you go up one on the Richter scale, it's 30 times greater in impact. Now, Columbia University tells us there's not one fault line as previously understood, but two fault lines, and that the possibility of a 6.0 or even a 7.0 earthquake, a million times stronger than previously understood, is real. Now, here are some statements that have been made by the folks from Entergy that are of concern. In 1965, the statement was that they could handle a 5.0 earthquake. In their 2011 plans for relicensing, they said we can handle a 5.5, maybe a 6.0. Jerry Nappy, the Entergy spokesman, after the Fukushima disaster, said we can handle a 6.0, and then after the earthquake in Virginia, he said we can handle a 7.0. No substantiation. This is a real issue. They can't handle greater than a 5.0. They haven't provided evidence that they can handle greater than a 5.0, and they certainly can't handle a 7.0. The main water line for firefighting from the town is not earthquake tested. There are real issues with seismic. When the Nuclear Regulatory Commission was asked by the Lieutenant Governor to expedite their evaluation of the seismic risk, a spokeswoman for the NRC told the New York Post, "We're not going to expedite because we don't think this is a serious issue." This is an aging plant. You all know that when a plant is brand new, it can do things, or it is safer than a plant that is 40 years old. Now, my friends on the right side of the table are going to say that $1 billion has been invested in this plant. But remember, a lot has to do with components that cannot be repaired because, for example, buried pipes. You know, in 2009, there was an employee of Entergy who found himself standing in leaking water from a buried pipe, and that water had tritium in it. And the General Accounting Office, again, don't listen to Riverkeeper, listen to the federal government. The General Accounting Office issued a study last year that said as plants age and corrosion worsens, you're going to have a larger risk to the health and safety of people associated with this plant because of the risk of leaking buried pipes. Fire safety. You know, recently the Nuclear Regulatory Commission denied a request by Entergy for 50, or if you measure by the number of places there are exemptions from fire safety sought by Entergy, 100 different places where Entergy proposed not to satisfy governing federal law on fire safety. They said, well, we don't need automatic systems. We can have someone walk around and they'll inspect, and that will be plenty. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission denied 42 out of the 50 requests within the last couple of weeks or a month ago, but what they did not deny is a request in 2008 for Entergy to maintain grossly substandard insulation on their reactor cables. These are the cables that bring power to the reactor core. Now, in the 90s, the predecessor owner bought substandard cable that's supposed to be able to handle a fire and have insulation for an hour, but it turns out it only was rated for 24 minutes. They bought cheap, they got cheap. And by the way, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission knew as early as 1994 that this HEMIC cable was substandard. Now, did Entergy, with all that $1 billion that they've invested, replace the insulation on those cables? No, they asked the Nuclear Regulatory Commission for an exemption, said 24 minutes is plenty. We really don't need that hour. After all, there's only 18 million people living around here. And the Nuclear Regulatory Commission granted that exemption. Beyond fire safety, you have issues associated with spent fuel. Now, here you get into the essential problem with the nuclear industry. After 3 Mile Island and after Fukushima, investment in nuclear plants and building new nuclear plants became virtually impossible. These plants were supposed to be retired at the end of 40 years. They said our spent fuel pools will handle up to 5 to 7 years worth of spent fuel. That's so little you could keep them far enough apart so that if they ever lost coolant, if they ever lost the water that covers them, in an earthquake, in a fire, in a terrorist attack, which, by the way, the National Academy of Sciences told Congress in 2005, these spent fuel pools in our nuclear reactors in this country are vulnerable to terrorist attack. They're not under a containment dome. They're in buildings that are vulnerable to terrorist attack. But as originally envisioned, you could lose the water and you wouldn't have a fire. Twice, Entergy and its predecessor owner was forced to increase the number of spent fuel rods in the pools because there's nowhere to put these rods. Again, something I think everybody on this panel could agree with is that it is obscene that there is nowhere to move the spent fuel to. You cannot pack these rods any more tightly than they are now packed. And Entergy is forced to remove some of the older fuel and put it in dry cask in order to put the new fuel in when they repower. This is not acceptable. The evacuation plan also is, as some have referred to it, a fantasy document, but I'm not going to refer to it as a fantasy document. I'm going to quote James Lee Witt, a former head of the FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Authority, who, at the request of Governor Pataki, did a study of the adequacy of the plan. It's a 10-mile plan. Now, Mr. Witt said that the plans are built on compliance with regulations rather than a strategy that leads to structures and systems to protect from radiation exposure. For those of you who didn't follow that, all the law students I know understood it, what he's saying is it's a paper plan for a paper emergency. It will not give you structures and systems that will protect you from radiation exposure. A couple of facts from the plan. Number one, parents are supposed to evacuate separately from their children if an emergency happens at school, like that's going to happen. Perhaps that's why Mr. Witt said that these plans do not consider the reality and impacts of spontaneous evacuation. The main problem is that when we saw a real emergency in Fukushima, Bill Borchard, who is the head of operations at NRC, told Commissioner Yachko, the chairman of the NRC, to tell the ambassador in Japan to get our people out of a 50-mile zone. You could not get our people out of a 50-mile zone here in New York. You cannot get 18 million people out. Now, Entergy may say that, well, it'll all happen slowly and orderly, and we don't have to worry about evacuating 18 million people. They don't know that. There can be a fast-moving accident. The simple truth is, Mr. Witt was working for Governor Pataki. Governor Pataki was not looking to seek plant closure. Mr. Witt told the truth, and now we know that this plan is patently insufficient. The unreliability of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Again, don't take my word for it. Not everybody here voted for President Obama, but I want you to know what President Obama said when he was candidate Obama about the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. It is a moribund agency, captive of the industry that it regulates. That is a pretty strong statement even for a political candidate. Now, some evidence that backs up what the president is saying. The relicensing process for Indian Point, you'd think with the seriousness of the evacuation issue, the new information about the seismic risk, the fire safety issue, the terrorism risk identified by the National Academy of Sciences, that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission would want to investigate those things in the relicensing process. Not one of them will be handled in the relicensing process. It's not important enough to the NRC. Remember what they said, what they told that Post reporter, we're not going to rush into any investigation of the seismic issue because we don't think it's that important. Now, we've talked a lot about risk to people and property. I want to talk for a little while about impacts to fish, because we are an organization that cares about the fish. We don't care about it primarily in this case because we care about the people primarily, but we care about the fish greatly too. The New York State Department of Environmental Conservation in 2010 told the Entergy Corporation install closed cycle cooling, which will reduce the fish kill, the fish mortality by about 95%, and Entergy said no. Now, I want you to understand the fish mortality is very real. There's 1 billion fish, eggs, larvae, shrimp, crabs destroyed by the Entergy cooling system every year. And 95% reduction would help us with the fact that we have 10 out of our 13 keystone species in the Hudson in decline. Just recently, the Atlantic sturgeon was listed as an endangered species, the short-nosed sturgeon, also an endangered species. You know, we're going to need our commercial fisheries one day. We do today, but we're going to need it especially in the future as population grows. So the fact that the Wedgewire proposal that Entergy has put forward not only is not tested at any nuclear facility, it's never been installed at a nuclear facility, but by their own admission, it's at least 30 to 40% less effective at controlling the damage to fish by them being entrained into the plant, and it doesn't control the effects of impingement onto the screens, which you would avoid with closed-cycle cooling, and it doesn't control the thermal issue, the fact that the water is discharged 8 degrees warmer. I want to also mention that when the Nuclear Regulatory Commission did an evaluation of the issues at Indian Point after Fukushima, they found that there are some pretty significant areas of the Fukushima plant that are not up to code. They found that Indian Point had not inspected its reactor hydrogen control technology. They call them recombiners, even though they were supposed to have 6 years earlier. They could not certify that those recombiners were adequate for service, and that shows you something about this plant operator. They also could not say that they had done their necessary inspection of the intake screens. And again, the intake screens are necessary to keep the plant cool. Keeping the plant cool is necessary to prevent a major accident. How can you not do these inspections and then say you spend $1 billion, you're a good bunch of people? How can you not replace the cable insulation when you know that it will give you 60% less protection from a fire than what the code requires? So I want you to consider that this is a little bit like a situation in, again, for the law students. The standard, be sure, beyond a reasonable doubt, before you do certain things. Before you relicense a plant like this, in a location like this, don't you want to be sure beyond a reasonable doubt that it is safe? So when you think about all the risks that we've talked about, many of them which will not be considered at all in the relicensing process, and when you think about the things that my colleague Ashok Gupta is going to tell you about the availability of alternatives, this really becomes an open and shut case. And thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Ashok Gupta, who is Director of Programs and a Senior Energy Economist with the Natural Resources Defense Council, where he works with his colleagues on global warming policies, energy efficiency, renewables, sustainable building design, and transportation policy. He has a bachelor's degree in physics and math from Georgetown University and a master's degree in economics from American University. Mr. Gupta is NRDC's representative for Mayor Bloomberg's Sustainability Advisory Board and Energy Policy Task Force.
Thank you, Mike. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's great to see such a good turnout. For a minute, I thought we were here to talk about fracking, because that's kind of the thing that turns people out these days, but it seems that nuclear does too. I think all energy issues end up being quite controversial, and I think what I want to focus in on is really the trade-offs and the challenges we all face in trying to meet our energy needs. I mean, I think every one of us, enjoys all of the benefits of having electricity, having energy, and we want reliable power. We want it to be actually cheap. And the question is, how can we meet the energy needs and do it in a way that is affordable and do it in a way that minimizes impacts? We're not going to be in a world where we have no impacts and get free or cheap energy. And that's the real world that we have to deal with in terms of, learning to live with impacts. We learn to live with impacts because we feel we have no choice. And having worked on energy policy for over 20 years at NRDC and have been thinking about energy issues for a long time, we know there are trade-offs and we have to make tough decisions. And no source of energy or electricity, in this case, is risk-free. So whether you're dealing with coal, whether you're dealing with natural gas, whether you're dealing with nuclear, whether you're dealing with hydro, I mean, there are impacts with all of the different sources of electricity. And the question is really, what risks do we want to take? How do we want to manage those risks? How do we meet our electricity needs? And that's the challenge. That's the debate. That's that's what we're all trying to figure out. And so don't take this issue very lightly. I mean, clearly, as Paul's laid out, a lot of risks, and we've learned to live with them. Can we find alternatives that are affordable and, deal with this risk at least and say, there are solutions out there. And our study, our conclusion is that lights will not go out. We can meet our energy needs, and to kind of have some peace of mind and not have this risk out there, it's well worth it. So let me quickly go through some thoughts here. First of all, electricity is a complicated business in terms of how we generate it, how we use it, the fact that you can't store it, you need to kind of generate it and use it almost instantaneously. Demand fluctuates, of course, during the day, during the seasons, so we build our system to basically have a high level of reliability for the hottest summer peak day. So the system is built. There's a lot of redundancy in the system, as there should be, to be able to make sure that lights don't go out. And the system is built, certainly in terms of the New York City part of it, to make sure that we have, the probability is to have one outage every 10 years. So the system is built to that level of reliability. And those of us who live here know that this is one of the most reliable electric systems in the whole world. And we want it to stay that way. I mean, that's essential. Even beats the cost. I mean, electricity is expensive in part because we want the reliability. And we don't want to do anything that risks that reliability. So I think there are a lot of trade-offs of the different sources, and we can talk about, coal in terms of health and greenhouse gas emissions, natural gas in terms of fracking and water, nuclear in terms of the risks you heard about, and how we kind of create the right portfolio of resources to meet our energy needs. One other thing to keep in mind as we talk later, as we go on today, is going to be the issue of, we often talk about capacity or megawatts and energy megawatt hours. It's important to keep the distinction that you can have power plants like Indian Point, 2,000 megawatts, that can operate, when they're operating all the time. So they generate a lot of electricity and a lot of energy for the system that serves the region. And you can have other power plants, natural gas peaking plants that operate on hot summer peak days. You have other sources like wind and solar that are available when there's wind and when there's sun. The idea is to have an integrated system so you can have all of these different sources combining to meet our energy needs. And I'll come back to that, but it's important to think about the system in terms of both capacity, megawatts, and energy, megawatt hours. And we know we can't rely on just one source of energy. I mean, basically the idea that, our system is built on diversity of fuels is very important. If you look at what's happened over the last 20 years, though, and Mike referred to too, in terms of, what's been built in the United States over the last 20 years, it's been primarily natural gas and wind. We really haven't been building new coal plants by and large in the United States. You'll see, obviously, all in China and India, a lot of coal plants being built. You haven't seen nuclear plants being built in the last 30 years. And the market and the policy in the United States has driven basically the generation mix towards more natural gas and more wind. So that's the last 20 years in terms of what's been the trend in terms of fuel mix. And if you look at the next 20 years, I would say that, we might build some new nuclear plants, but you won't see a lot, in the next 20 years. We and many others had McKinsey do an analysis of the next 20 years in terms of how to reduce global warming pollution and what that scenario would look like in terms of achieving the targets we need to achieve. And what you see from that analysis based on, economics and lots of other factors and whatever policies we have or could have, is that the greatest resource that we have available to us in the next 20 years is, of course, energy efficiency. The fact that we waste 20 to 30% of the energy we use when we have all these impacts that we're trying to minimize, why we're not as aggressively as possible going after efficiency, and that's what McKinsey lays out. Basically, half of the carbon reductions we need to achieve between now and 2030 can be achieved through energy efficiency, therefore at a negative cost. And if you want to build the right portfolio of resources to meet our energy needs, minimize impacts, you have to start with efficiency, and you really have to scale it up, and there's no reason why, every building can't be 20, 30, 50% more efficient than it is now, and with existing technologies. So there are challenges in terms of information and financing and other implementation, but there's not an issue of technology. It's an issue of, are we going to get our act together and actually go after the energy efficiency? Clearly, wind has been on a huge increase in terms of the last 10 years. It's primarily been driven by state renewable portfolio standards. And Texas is one of the leading states, so you see this all over the country. New York State has built 1,000 megawatts of wind in the last few years. If you look at what has New York State added in terms of generation capacity, it's been wind upstate and some natural gas downstate. So that's kind of what the trend line has been. We think solar has huge, huge potential and needs to be invested in. Countries like Germany has done a huge amount, and they don't have a lot of sun, but they have really made a commitment to solar. And recently, as you know, they've also made a commitment not to continue with their nuclear fleet post-Fukushima. So I think there are decisions to be made, and there are trade-offs. I mean, there's cost trade-offs and other trade-offs, but there are options here in terms of what one can do. And there's also offshore wind. I mean, New York State has huge opportunity in terms of what we can do in terms of offshore wind, which reduces the need for transmission, but that doesn't mean, we're not supportive of and shouldn't have more transmission to be able to bring more power from upstate. So I think there are a lot of different ways to kind of create that portfolio in terms of efficiency, wind upstate, offshore wind, solar, and also part of the mix has to be the repowering of existing natural gas plants. Our existing natural gas fleet is very inefficient. I mean, you could easily double the efficiency of those power plants. In other words, for the same amount of fuel, you could get twice as much electricity. And there's no reason why every power plant that's natural gas shouldn't be repowered and made more efficient, so we can again get more efficiency at existing natural gas plant. This is more the 2030 scenario I'm talking about in terms of the different resources and what can and should be done to help meet our energy needs, keep the costs down, and minimize the impacts. The 2030 to 2050 scenario, if one wants to look down that, is more complicated. And there the issue is going to be really the competition between, I think, 3 different technologies in terms of how quickly they can compete in the marketplace and bring their costs down. And this is going to be carbon capture and storage. So if we want to have a future where we'll keep using coal and natural gas, we have to capture the carbon and sequester it. Can it scale up? Can it bring its cost down? Can it prove itself? I think we can do a lot of demonstrations in the next 20 years. And this is on a global basis at this point. Can we bring the cost down? Will it work? The renewable option. Can the renewable option really scale up, deal with the issue of variability, therefore deal with the issue of storage? How will that play out in the next 10 to 20 years in terms of costs and really being able to meet the need? And third is nuclear, the next generation of nuclear power. Can it be made safe? Can we deal with the issues of waste? And so nuclear will continue to be a very important part of the debate and discussion about how do we meet our energy needs long-term in a way that is low carbon. And I think the jury's out in terms of where the marketplace will be. Certainly if you look at the marketplace over the last 20, 30 years, I would argue nuclear was not being built because it didn't make economic sense. People were going to natural gas and wind. It was driven by markets, and it was also driven by policy, to the extent that we had renewable portfolio standards. So markets and policy combined are critical in terms of shaping that future. In terms of a little bit about Indian Point specifically, I mean, with Riverkeeper, we had Synapse do an analysis in terms of could we shut down Indian Point and obviously do it in a way that keeps the lights on, minimizes the costs. And based on where we are now in terms of surpluses because of the slowing down of the economy and lots of other reasons, there's plenty of electricity in the system to be able to meet our energy needs, meet our electricity needs, and be able to not relicense Indian Point. And I think people can, if they disagree about what are the cost implications, not that you couldn't do it and meet our reliability needs. And then the cost implication answer then becomes a matter of what we choose to do. What is the mix we want to have in terms of replacement? And how quickly and what's the timing of getting that replacement in place? But there are lots of options, lots of choices. We don't have to have our lights go out if we don't relicense Indian Point. So I think that kind of, we can learn to live with risks when we think we don't have any other choice. But in this case, I would argue that we have choices, we have options. We can take those choices. Whether we will or not is a, collective decision of what what governments do, what policies we put in place, and so on. But from an energy point of view, I would, nobody can tell you that you can't shut it down and keep the lights on. I'm going to stop there and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Arthur Jerry Kramer, mostly known as Jerry. He's a 23-year veteran of the New York State Assembly. He was chair of the Ways and Means Committee and the Energy Committee, and has a long-time interest in energy and environmental issues. He's an author of the original power plant siting law and was a strong proponent of last year's renewal of the siting law. Jerry was one of the original group that founded the New York Affordable Reliable Electricity Alliance, which now has over 200 members, which includes chamber and business development groups, unions, utility companies, and a broad array of major New York companies that have a deep interest in energy issues. The group participates in forums, public hearings, and educational sessions on the critical energy issues facing New York State. His commentaries on political issues are seen in Huffington Post, Politico, and a number of major television networks. Jerry.
Thanks very much, Mike Gerard. First of all, thank you for the Columbia Law School notebook. I will cherish it. I have a daughter who may want to come here very soon. I've spent a lot of time in this neighborhood. And invested a lot of money 1 block from here at Barnard, where my daughter graduated this past year. And she's contemplating coming back here to Columbia Law School. So if I get any brownie points tonight, I'm going to do my best. I guess I should mention that for those who might not necessarily agree with my position on energy laws, I also sponsored the automobile lemon law many years ago, which was the forerunner to a lot of consumers gaining a lot of rights that they never had before. It was fun battling the auto industry. I invited tonight as my guest the most visible supporter of nuclear power in America, but President Obama was downtown raising money at a variety of events, so he respectfully declined. I want to thank you for the opportunity. I think what's great is that I have a chance to be on a panel not only with John, but with Paul and with Ashok, who are very strong proponents for their position, which clearly in the time ahead you'll find out the many reasons why I disagree. But these forums are important. They're important because the public has to hear 2 sides of every issue. The public has to understand that there are facts that should survive the emotion and the trauma and the screaming that you get at public hearings. And these kind of forums give us an opportunity to have a more objective, laid-back look at what's going on here in New York State. I must say that there's something from me as a longtime legislator and observer of the New York scene that I find it surreal over the energy debate here in New York State. Groups of supposedly informed citizens show up at public meetings. In many instances, the organizations that get them there are supported by private foundations, and they oppose every form of electric power that has been, man has been able to invent. It's an incessant campaign of no, 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 and fear, fear, fear. And even though I think that this is also a function of, besides the issue of safety, which I'll let John cover, it's an issue of jobs, higher energy costs, diminished opportunities here for New York State, and candidly, it deals with the economic survival of this state and this country. If you take a look at the New York landscape, it's really scary when you think of there is organized opposition to hydrofracking, nuclear power, and windmills. Windmills, right. 3 upstate communities have banned the installation of windmills on the grounds that they deteriorate property values and the noise is a bother to the people. One of the most striking things that I experienced was attending 2 public hearings on Long Island 5 years ago in connection with the installation of windmills in the Atlantic Ocean off of Jones Beach. Most of the environmental groups supported it. Over 1,000 people attended each hearing to oppose the windmills on the ground that they would create, quote, visual pollution for the people who are on the shore. And so those 2 windmills, which were part of a project proposed by Florida Power and Light, didn't gain the public support that it needed. The costs became very high. The projects were abandoned. But it was fascinating to listen to people argue against windmills in the Atlantic Ocean. And I'm not talking about windmills a mile away. I'm talking about a minimum of 5 miles or more. Nevertheless, there were screaming opponents and who said, you'll destroy our neighborhoods by putting windmills in the Atlantic Ocean. The other thing that shocks me very candidly is it seems that the opponents want their First Amendment rights to speak and say whatever they want at these public hearings, but if you get up and speak on anything that's pro-energy, you are hollered and hooted down because they don't like your position. I spoke at a hydrofracking hearing that DEC had a couple of months ago, and I was amazed at the amount of hostility on the part of the audience just to listen to somebody else's views on a controversial subject. Probably one of the worst displays of misinformation that I've seen in my lifetime is this campaign to close Indian Point. As we sit here tonight, it's not a secret. We're talking about $5 gasoline, the cost of fuel, whether people will be able to afford to buy food as opposed to fuel. Apartment buildings that surround us and the rest of the city use number 6 oil, number 5 oil. We are married to Arab oil, and we continue to be married, and yet we have within our community at large people who say no to this kind of power, no to that kind of power, and of course New York State is a loser. And let's talk about Indian Point. First of all, I should mention that with the advent of all these electric cars, the Nissan Leaf, the Chevy Volt, I went into a garage the other day near my apartment in the city, and now there's a sign up saying that they can service electric cars. Well, those electric cars need more power. They're going to have power. Somebody's got to provide it, and we can continue to say this is all the power that we need, but the fact of the matter is we need a lot more power. The Electric Power Research Institute said that when gasoline reaches a certain level in price, it's cheaper to use electric power than it is to use oil power. I want to make this clear at the outset. The group that I had, this New York area, yes, we support the licensing of Indian Point, but I can categorically say that we want it to be safe. We want the NRC to impose whatever limitations they should, whatever safety regulations. They want all the things that should be done to keep the facility safe. But the concept of closing Indian Point is just something that's not in the interests of the people in this room. Yes, it's got to be safe, and it can't be a danger to this region. I've followed the history of this property since the early 70s, when as a member of the Assembly, I voted at the time for a very controversial purchase of Indian Point by the New York Power Authority. It was the state buying up a private plant because the state felt they had an interest in acquiring more facilities. I know the history of this plant since it was taken over by the owner Entergy, second largest operator of nuclear power plants in America. They've invested, during the time that I've been an observer of everything going on there, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars to upgrade this plant and to make it a plant that's safe and passes continuous inspection. Let's talk about, if I could name one nuclear power plant of the 104 in the United States of America and the 30 some odd plants which are either located in cities or surrounding a nearby heavily populated area, there is no facility in America that has been inspected as much as Indian Point by the federal government. The cries of complaint from Ashok and from Paul have been heard by the NRC on many occasions and resulted in additional inspections, and additional inspections. I submit something else, that as a fuel alternative, nuclear power is a lot safer for this nation than oil. It seems every time oil is the issue in some far-off country, we start a war. And we may say it's for national security, but you know that deep down in most of the cases, the wars that we start have as their underlying principle, oil, oil, oil. And yet we send New Yorkers and people around this country to Iraq and Afghanistan who die in the pursuit of oil. When you want to talk about the Horizon explosion a few years ago, which really destroyed all those states in the Gulf of Mexico community, if you want to talk about safety, oil in and of itself is not necessarily the safest product for us to rely on. John Kelly is going to point out that Indian Point is far safer than coal plants, which kill 30,000 plus Americans a year. And gas plants, you want to talk about safety? Connecticut last year, a major accident which killed a number of people working on the plant site. Energy, I think, as Ashok pointed out, it's a dangerous business. There's no such thing as I've got the best energy because this is the safest. Because each and every energy that we talk about has some portion of its production which is inherently dangerous. Let me talk about, again, and my views are from 30,000 feet up. Indian Point is an enormous generator of jobs and dollars to Westchester and the counties. The Nuclear Energy Institute did a study on Indian Point a short time ago and said that it generates $1 billion annually in economic activity in terms of wages, purchases, and tax payments. School districts, villages, towns, and the county rely heavily on Indian Point for the dollars that it throws off. Let's talk about jobs. 1,100 people work at Indian Point. These are people with highly specialized position, all of whom live pretty much in the immediate 7-county area. The Westchester Business Alliance did a study and found that 11,000 other jobs are connected with Indian Point's operations in the Hudson River Valley. And let me mention a word that you will not hear tonight from this distinguished panel, and the word is Shoreham. The Shoreham nuclear power plant was forced to close in 1989, and I was finishing up my career in the legislature because of pressure from some of the same groups who vocally oppose Indian Point. Shoreham is a great history lesson for all of us. Today, every man, woman, and child on Long Island pays $2,000 a year on their utility bills towards the Shoreham debt. I know, I helped write the Shoreham Settlement Agreement. You can look it up. It's on every Power Authority bill. There is a special surcharge for the closing of Indian Point in 1989, Shoreham. But the fact is that people on Long Island are paying for Shoreham's closure today in the year 2012 and will pay for another 21 years until the debt from Shoreham has been retired. So beyond the issue of Indian Point as a cash cow for so many people is where do we get the 2,000 megawatts? And obviously that's where Ashok and I, part company. There's no question in my mind, because it's factual, Indian Point keeps our subways running in the city. Indian Point keeps our hospital emergency rooms and the lights on at St. Luke's, a block from here. 2,000 megawatts of power is a lot of power. How much is it? It's enough to meet the needs of Boston, Baltimore, and to have some left over. It's enough electricity to provide light for 1.5 million homes. On a typical day, it provides 25% of the power for the greater New York City area. My best look at this whole picture is if you take it offline, you're playing economic Russian roulette with the power in this city. And then comes the question of, as Ashok respectfully pointed out, we can replace Indian Point. It is easy to say what we can replace, but the facts don't support the concept. This city and this state needs more power today, not less power. Shut it down, say the opponents. We don't need power. We can get alternate powers. So let's talk a little bit about where the extra power is going to come from if we shut down Indian Point. Let's start out with we don't need the power. We can get it from modernized facility in downstate New York. Modernized facilities, we're shutting a plant down in Queens that's perfectly usable for power, the Paletti plant, which could easily been kept going. That community says you've overburdened us with the facilities that you've located. The idea that we can take a whole bunch of facilities in New York City and upgrade them is a great idea. The capital's not there, the will is not there, and there's no desire on the part of the corporate world to spend any money to modernize all of these plants in the city. So let's cross that off the list. It's also been suggested by Ashok's group that we should construct a new natural plant in some proximity to Indian Point, somewhere up the Hudson River Valley. Well, if you can't put a substation of a utility company anywhere in Manhattan, and you can't put it in Brooklyn or Queens, and you can't put it on Long Island, because people are going to turn out, how are you going to build a 500 megawatt facility to replace Indian Point? And then we're told, don't worry, we can also get power from Quebec. Well, the fact of the matter is, there is no way to wheel that power from Quebec to downstate New York. It's hydropower, and it's great, and it's cheap, and it's attractive, but you're not going to bring it downstate. So we passed this power plant siting law last year, and I had a lot to do with the old power plant siting law, but let's get realistic. The 2,000 megawatts are just not there. The last thing is, everybody in this room is going to be willing to turn off your air conditioners during the summer at the height of the heat, because as a goodwill, for goodwill purposes and a great public citizen, you want to provide the extra energy to replace Indian Point. I'm sure you know that's going to happen. And there's not going to be a 500 megawatt facility in the Hudson River Valley. And the last thing you should keep in mind is it will take 4 power plants to replace Indian Point, and there are no volunteers in the downstate region for the 4 power plants. So what do we face with this great dilemma about, excuse me, about Indian Point Power? We have to decide what the trade-off is. Ashok's group tells us that there is a trade-off. We can replace the 2,000 megawatts and be ready for this. Be prepared as a consumer to pay more money for power that has to be brought in from out of state. And they say the other part of the trade-off, if you read the statements, is your CO2, that dirty, dirty air that we worry about, the global warming, will increase dramatically because we will lose the nuclear power, which is the cleanest form of power. I can only say this, I don't know how many people remember what happened in California when the entire state of California was held hostage by out-of-state utility companies who were charging $1,000 per megawatt to the people in that state. It cost Governor Gray Davis his seat as governor. He was recalled after that year, and it left the state with billions of dollars in debt that it had assumed for this out-of-state power. So the answer really, from my perspective, is, and let me tell you this, 2 groups that are against Indian Point, what do the people who are the real experts tell us? The New York Building Congress does their own study. They've got a stake in it because their members are the people who build the big buildings here in New York City. And they say that the retirement of Indian Point would lead to higher electric prices and jeopardize the system. Mayor Bloomberg had the city pay for a study by the Charles River Associates, which basically said costs would go up $300 million a year, public subsidies would be required, billions of dollars in new cost, and carbon emissions 15% or more an increase. Now, I don't have to tell you, if you lived in the Bronx and you had a young child suffering from asthma, our air quality right now is at its lowest and poorest ebb. Closing down a plant that causes no emissions is a further threat to this region, as we will be exposed to more CO2, not less. Last of all, the independent power operators. You know, the guys who run the system every day testified in front of an assembly hearing 4 weeks ago that we can't do without Indian Point Power. We would lose the reliability, and if you shut the plant down, it's an important plant for wheeling power in the city. You know, we've gone through a pretty tough time here in this country with this recession, but I can only point out to you that it's not really the time for New York, the Empire State, to be shutting down power plants with no legitimate replacement. I've spent the better part of my life in the political arena, and I welcome an open and honest debate. But candidly, the debate on Indian Point has been short of honesty and short on facts. And for that reason, Indian Point has to survive. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our final speaker is John Kelly. John Kelly is a certified health physicist who worked at Indian Point for 32 years. He was responsible for licensing, regulatory compliance, emergency preparedness, and other areas. John has long lived 4 miles from the plant and tells us that he is certain that this is one of the safest places to live in New York.
Thank you very much. First of all, I just wanted to make a point. I'm speaking as a private citizen. I am retired from Entergy. I'm not representing the company. I'm representing myself. I provide consulting assistance to the New York area organization on a pro bono basis, okay? I know a legal word, okay? And I'm here because I'm interested in this issue very significantly. As it was pointed out, I built my home in 1971 in Rockland County, less than 4 miles from Indian Point. I've raised my family there. I retired from Entergy in 2003. I'm still there. I know the plant's safe. I know it's being operated safely, and I've chosen to stay where I am despite New York State's taxes. Many of my neighbors have had to move out of New York State because of the cost of living in this area when they retire. Fortunately, I have a good enough pension where I've been able to stay there despite the costs of living in New York State. But as many of you people in this room know, when New Yorkers get to the point of retirement, most of them can't stay here. Many of our friends have moved out of the area simply because they can't afford to live in New York State with the cost of power and the cost of taxes. It's something we all have to take into consideration. I'd like to say a few things about Indian Point and some of my experiences there. All right, I started at Con Edison back in 1970 and then worked at the Indian Point plant starting in 1971. I was there when Indian Point 1 was still operating. I'm glad it's closed. Indian Point 2 and Indian Point 3 were under construction at the time. I was there when they were pouring the concrete and lacing the rebar. When I saw the containment structures going up, they are massive. The reinforcing bar is as thick around as your forearm. The walls are 6.5 feet thick at the base and 4.5 feet thick at the top. You have a huge internal volume. The reason for the containment structure is really twofold. First of all, a design basis accident at a pressurized water reactor assumes that because of some accident you have a guillotine break of one of the reactor coolant pipes with an instantaneous vaporization of all the water in the reactor coolant system to cause, literally called a steam explosion into the containment structure. And the containment structure is designed to contain such a steam explosion and also to provide radiation shielding from any radioactivity that might be released from the core in such an accident. That's the reason it was designed that way, the thickness and the strength. In addition, at Indian Point, because of the location of the plant, they also installed a stainless steel liner inside of the containment throughout the entire structure. Interestingly, that provided some other benefits which were not intended at the original design. After 9/11, there was a big concern because one of the airplanes had flown down the Hudson Valley, and there was a concern that one of the planes could have been used to impact Indian Point and perhaps cause a nuclear accident. It was demonstrated by engineering calculations and also by experiments driving airplane components into concrete walls out in the desert in the Southwest. It was shown that an airplane could not penetrate the containment structure at Indian Point. Another aspect that I'd like to bring up is 3 Mile Island. The 3 Mile Island accident was a very serious accident involving a core melt and also a hydrogen explosion. It's also a pressurized water reactor like Indian Point, and the containment structure contained that hydrogen explosion and also contained essentially all of the radioactivity released from the core during that core melt at 3 Mile Island. And so the containment structure at Indian Point is a very rugged structure. I'd like to point out one thing relative to a point that was raised a little earlier about Chernobyl. The Chernobyl reactor is an RBMK reactor. Only one of that type of reactor was built in the U.S. It was built during World War II in the state of Washington for the sole purpose of producing plutonium for weapons. It was immediately determined to be an extraordinarily intrinsically unstable reactor design and also intrinsically dangerous. And the U.S. shut that reactor down and has never built another one like it. The Soviets liked the design because it could produce plutonium and be allowed to be refueled online. It has a graphite core and no containment structure. And so when the Chernobyl accident occurred, that reactor, literally, the reactor itself caught fire, the graphite core. It's charcoal for all intents and purposes. And that eliminated, and without any containment, all of the radioactivity from that structure and from that reactor was released to the environment. There is no reactor like that anywhere else other than in Eastern Europe or in the Soviet Union. There are still 23 others of those still operating because they need the power in those areas despite the intrinsic lack of safety in that design. But the RBMK does not exist in this country and is not an issue even to think about. I'd like to also mention something else about this industry and how we learn things. I mentioned the 3 Mile Island accident. We learned a tremendous amount from that. At the time, reactor operators were trained on a simulator which was similar to your reactor, but in many ways different, at the manufacturer's training facilities. we learned that that wasn't good enough. And one of the major changes after 3 Mile Island was every reactor in the United States, all 104 of them, have to have a simulator which is identical to the control room of that plant and has basically computer programs that make that simulator respond like the plant does. Every time you make a change in the plant, you change the simulator in order to demonstrate that. 1 week out of every 6, our reactor operators are in that simulator retraining themselves on responses to plant transients and accidents. And these facilities provide a very, very good, solid training for these operators. We also found that you needed severe accident management guidelines. When you have an accident at a nuclear power plant, you have to go beyond the normal procedures. And you so therefore have severe accident management guidelines and procedures to follow in accident responses. Control room operators are empowered, senior reactor operators are empowered on their own authority to implement those procedures when necessary in order to protect the public. Unfortunately, in Fukushima, I don't know the details of all of the administrative controls they have, but my understanding from what I've read of that accident was they did have severe accident procedures that could be followed, but they needed to get the top management approval before they could implement them. And so the implementation of those procedures took hours to days, and by the time the approval was obtained, it was too late to actually implement it. And so this is, again, another change. More will come out as we learn, and we will learn many more lessons from Fukushima, and we will apply them in the industry in this country as we did with the 3 Mile Island accident responses. Another aspect of what goes on here is we talked about inspections of Indian Point. Besides inspection teams that come in to look at special tasks and special projects, you have resident inspectors who actually work at the plant. I don't know how many are in force right now, it's at least 2, and in the past there's been as many as 3 or 4 people who are there. They have access to everything and everyone on site, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They issue monthly, I believe it's monthly inspection reports. All inspection reports are public record and are available on the NRC website. And so all of this information is documented and made available to the public. I'd like to talk about the seismic issue since it was raised. Indian Point was designed to meet a particular seismic design that was considered back in the late 1960s when the plants were being designed. I'm not speaking of Indian Point 1. It's been decommissioned. It was decommissioned in 1974. But for Indian Point 2 and 3, they met seismic design criteria that were applied at that time. This became under review because the New York State geologists raised questions about the seismic design in 1977, and so special hearings were conducted by the NRC to revisit this issue. After a couple of years of discussions and fact-finding and so forth, it was determined that the utility would fund a design of a microseismic monitoring network, interestingly designed and operated by Lamont Doherty Geological Observatory, in order to monitor the Ramapo Fault and determine if the design was appropriate. The conclusion of those hearings was that yes, the design for Indian Point was appropriate, met all requirements of the regulations, and the plant was safe in terms of a seismic issue. Regarding seismicity also, Fukushima actually survived the earthquake fairly well. It wasn't the earthquake that caused the disaster, it was the monstrous tsunami that struck the coast. A tsunami is physically impossible at Indian Point. It's 26 miles from the ocean. You're not going to get a tsunami coming up the Hudson River to get to Indian Point. The issue of seismicity, however, was addressed further as part of the preparation for the relicensing of the plant. An independent plant evaluation was performed and published in 2008, and it concluded that the seismic design of the plant was sufficient and appropriate. Again, the NRC has also commissioned the Electric Power Research Institute to come up with a seismic analysis for eastern and central U.S. plants. That has recently been issued, and so questions will be raised about seismicity based on that study. Again, that will be looked at for Indian Point, even though seismicity may not be an issue in terms of the special hearings for relicensing, extension of the plant. It still will be an issue that will be addressed there, and also seismic issues raised as a result of the Fukushima accident will also be addressed in all of the plants in the United States, including Indian Point. Another issue I wanted to mention here is emergency planning briefly. The basis for emergency planning was published in a document called New Reg 0396. It was published actually in January of 1979 for comment. And of course, the 3 Mile Island accident happened 2 months later. After that document was reviewed in some detail after the 3 Mile Island accident, it was issued in final form as an appropriate basis for emergency planning. One of the criteria in that design is that you must provide detailed emergency planning for people who have the potential to be exposed to a radiation exposure of anywhere between 1 and 5 rem of exposure during the duration of the accident and the duration of their time in the area. The U.S. government determined that that design criteria can be met out to a distance of 10 miles for design basis accident at nuclear power plants. And that's the reason for the 10-mile zone in Indian Point, for Indian Point and all other reactors in this country. The issue relative to the 50-mile range at Fukushima was because there were 4 reactors and potentially a spent fuel pool involved. Some engineers sat down, did some engineering calculations, and determined that with that much involvement in Fukushima, there was the possibility of a dose of 1 to 5 rem out to a distance of 50 miles, and that was the basis upon which the decision was made. Chairman Jackso of the NRC there was this is available on the NRC website, the analysis that was done for that 50-mile recommendation for evacuation of Americans at that time. We talked briefly about the consequences of shutting down Indian Point in terms of environmental impacts from energy production in order to replace the power. Back in 2003, we did a study on this, of the costs, the environmental costs of shutting down Indian Point and replacing it with the available power that they had at that time, and it's been looked at again by the Charles River study that was commissioned by New York City. To put it in some perspective, if Indian Point were to shut down, the replacement power from the plants that are available right now would result in about 14 million tons of additional carbon dioxide into the environment in the Hudson River Valley in New York City. That would increase the New York State CO2 load by about 15%. If you decide you want to capture that, you can convert it to calcium carbonate. It can be done, the procedures are there, right? The engineering is there. However, it would produce 26 million tons of calcium carbonate every year. What are we going to do with that if we decide to sequester the CO2 and capture it? It's not something that you can easily deal with. We can say, oh, we'll capture the CO2. If you capture the CO2, what are you going to do with it, with that much 26 million tons of additional calcium carbonate? But that's a greenhouse gas. The things that are particularly of more concern to me are the 75,000 tons of sulfur oxides, the 23,000 tons of nitrogen oxides, the 2,000 tons of particulate matter of 10 micron diameter that would be spewed into the environment in the Hudson River Valley and New York City air in order to produce the additional electricity to replace Indian Point. The aggravation of asthma and bronchitis and pneumonia, all killers, for people who have compromised respiratory systems, are people who will die as a result of that pollution. We're already a non-attainment area, okay? We don't meet the EPA guidelines for air quality in this area. It's a non-attainment area, and it's going to aggravate it even more. And you need to generate power somehow. That will produce air pollution, and that is going to have something that's going to impact people. The Hudson River. This is an area that has been very much involved right from the beginning of Indian Point. When Indian Point was first licensed, the EPA said build cooling towers. It ended up in litigation, and that went on for about 5 years after the operation of the plant started. And at the end of that time, a settlement agreement was reached in which all parties agreed to that settlement. The settlement involved the New York State DEC, the EPA, many intervenor groups, Hudson River Fishermen's Association, the predecessor of Riverkeeper, and a number of other organizations, including the utilities as well. The utilities agreed to spend hundreds of millions of dollars to backfit the plant with variable speed pumps so that they could reduce flows in the wintertime, install bucket screens, and also many other different different issues that would backfit into the plant. And in addition, we said, the utility said they would spend $2 million a year for DEC to do studies on fish populations in the Hudson River to determine the impact of plant operation on the fish despite these backfits to the plants. And that research has gone on from 1981, I believe, was when it initiated, through at least through to 2003, the year I retired. I'm not sure whether that's continuing now or not. I really don't know. They chose 6 species of fish. The one that was considered most critical was the striped bass, because the striped bass lays free-floating eggs in the vicinity of Indian Point when the fish spawn in the Hudson River. And so they were considered to be the most, possibly the species that would be most affected by plant operations, and there was a great concern about that. Interestingly, between 1981 and the year 2003, the adult fish population for striped bass in the Hudson River has increased 20-fold. Now, I'm not suggesting Indian Point created additional striped bass, okay? What I am saying is it demonstrates that now there's 2 things that power plants cause damage to fish with: entrainment and impingement. The bucket screens and the reduced flow and so forth and so on was designed to address the impingement problem, and that has been addressed effectively to the best of my knowledge. The one thing you can't address is the process of entrainment. That is, when a fish egg gets drawn into the plant, those fish eggs undergo a thermal shock and a pressure shock and are killed. Just like about 95% of the fish eggs that exist that are laid in the Hudson River, they die as a result of natural processes in the environment and become food for other fish. That's why a fish lays so many eggs. We know that most of those eggs are going to die in the environment. All I'm saying is that the striped bass is thriving in the Hudson River, and although other fish populations have varied up or down, various other species, the conclusion I came to, at least at that point in time, was that the plant could not be demonstrated to have caused a material reduction in the adult fish populations of the 6 species that were studied for over 30 years in the Hudson, for 20 years in the Hudson River. One final point. Okay. Relative to emergency planning and plans for emergency plans. Interestingly, also, 1979 was a banner year. In November of 1979, a railroad train was derailed in Mississauga, Ontario. It's all available on the web. A city of 217,000 people. It's a suburb of Toronto. There were chemicals and propane tanks on that line. There was no emergency plan to evacuate the city. And yet, local governments do understand how to do evacuations. Chlorine was one of the substances on one of the tank cars. The decision was made to evacuate the city. It was done. They evacuated a hospital, nursing homes, private homes. They accomplished the evacuation in a timely and organized manner. Evacuations work. We have evacuated the Gulf Coast during the various hurricanes. For over 500,000 people have been evacuated. So if an evacuation is necessary, it can be done even without detailed plans. We have detailed plans out to 10 miles for all nuclear power plants in this country, and that provided a tremendous additional thing. For example, when we first started this, we found out that the police departments in Rockland County couldn't speak to each other because they all operated on different frequencies. And so one of the things that the nuclear power plant had to do was to fund an entirely new radio system in the county in order to provide the police the availability to communicate with each other. Okay, I'll conclude my comments with that.
Thanks very much. Now, each speaker has 5 minutes. I think, Ashok, you'd like to go next?
Yes, and I'll keep it brief so we can leave some room for questions and discussion too. Just 3 quick points. One is, totally agree that we as a community and as environmental groups can't be saying no to everything, and I think our groups are very good about not saying no to everything. We've supported transmission lines, we've supported power plants, we've supported lots of policies and particular projects in order to, to solve and meet our energy needs. So we would not be saying that Indian Point can be shut down if we weren't ready to support alternatives and urge others to do so also and provide the leadership. So we think of our role as not only supporting, but as leaders providing that support for others to also support it. And yes, we have more work to do, but at least we are committed to finding replacement and supporting alternatives and have done so for years. The second point I would make is that on the issue, it's great to hear about the harm to air quality and the impact on global warming that would occur. But again, I would say no groups have worked harder. I mean, NRDC's reputation for 40 years on clean air is well known. We care about air quality like no one else. We would not support or do anything that would jeopardize air quality. That would not be in interest of, for me to hear that we're going to support something that's going to hurt air quality, that's just, unbelievable. Nobody's worked harder on climate policy and dealing with global warming pollution than NRDC. And so when it comes to climate change, when it comes to air quality, under no circumstances would we take any position that would harm air quality or make it harder to achieve our global warming goals. The last point I'd make is, it sounds like replacing 2,000 megawatts is almost an impossible feat. It's not easy, but it's not impossible. I mean, I think when we did our analysis with Synapse, and I think there are issues, even with the New York City report didn't say it couldn't be done. They said, yes, there are cost issues, but that's because of the mix they chose to look at. You can look at a different mix and deal with the costs and carbon emissions, but the fact that you can replace it is not a question, in my view. Putting it in context, 2,000 megawatts from Indian Point. The state's overall capacity is approximately 40,000 megawatts. 2 out of 40,000, important, but not, impossible. New York City's peak demand is, a little over 12,000, but so 2,000, is, and of that peak, 80% has to be in New York City. And if you look at the way the reliability rules work, we have in the system, and we should, 20 to 30% supply above demand on a hottest summer peak day, because we've built that system to that level of reliability. So the fact that we have flexibility and room to deal with 2,000 megawatts, and especially if you think of, how much these 2,000 megawatts are outside of the city, 80% of our peak demand has to be in the city, and you can only import 5,000 megawatts right now into the city. And clearly there are proposals to bring more power into the city, but under the current, 5,000 can be brought into the city. It's that 5,000 of which Indian Point contributes to some of that 5,000 that's imported into the city. So when we looked at the numbers, when we had our experts look at the number, we say, not only could we replace, we have so many options and choices to be able to replace the 2,000 megawatts, that the idea that, again, we're putting our air quality at risk, our reliability of the system at risk is, in our view, clearly just not true. It's really a matter of if we want to do it, it can actually be done, and it's not a matter of whether it's possible. I mean, I don't believe, if anybody told you, we can't replace 2,000 megawatts in the next few years, I mean, it's hard for me to even imagine that we can't do it.
A couple of specifics to back up what Ashok has just said and to counter the no, we can't. This is like Obama night, I guess. Yes, we can. First of all, the report that we issued was issued not by us, didn't come out of our brains, it came out of Synapse Energy and Economics, which is a company that advises public utilities commissions, associations of public utilities commissions. It's a real mainstream firm. Again, you can tell, we think this is a big issue, and we want our arguments to be understood as coming from very reliable sources. So this is what they said. They said, number one, quoting the New York Independent System Operator, you can go through 2020 without building a stick of new power and close Indian Point tomorrow. You'll be fine through 2020 with the surplus that we have. That's number one. Number two, they say that there are 4 different techniques that if you just take the low-hanging fruit, you can get 2.5 times the power you get from Indian Point. I'll give you that breakdown. Number one, you can get about 1,700 megawatts of power by readily available energy efficiency, as readily available is measured by what has been provided from studies done in Massachusetts, in New Hampshire, in Hawaii. They're achieving these numbers. Number two, transmission lines. There's already a 500 megawatt transmission line going across the river. You could get another 1,000 megawatts or more from projects that are in the queue. And by the way, Riverkeeper is in the Wall Street Journal this week. That's not something that we always really like, but we're actually quite happy here because it's because we and Scenic Hudson said that we would sign on to a settlement that will allow a 1,000 megawatt power transmission project to be built. And that 1,000 megawatt power transmission, we were given money to do studies. We found there would be limited, if any, impacts of that power transmission. We got 60 miles of the transmission line taken out of sensitive habitats, and there was $117 million for restoration projects in the Hudson and in Lake Champlain. So the notion that we're not willing to put our good name associated with replacement power, frankly, is nonsense. There's also the possibility of getting 900 megawatts from repowering power plants, some of which are already being repowered, and you wouldn't have a single additional microgram of pollution in the city. You could actually reduce pollution and get more power and not use a single additional cubic foot of natural gas, by the way, by repowering these power plants, these old inefficient power plants in the city. And finally, and I mention it last as a pointed matter, you get 600 megawatts from readily available wind and solar. Some of you may have seen that the mayor's going out for proposals on wind and solar. And everybody says, oh, you environmentalists, all you think about is wind and solar. No, we think about that last. We think about the fact that these 4 options are going to give us possibly 2.5 times Indian Point. We just need to go ahead and do it. And as a matter of fact, you want to talk about the Mayor's Office? The Mayor's Office of Sustainability testified at the January 12th hearing that Mr. Kremer talked about earlier, and they said, well, yes, we can. It's just a question of the trade-offs. It's just a question of cost. And by the way, the Synapse study found that the cost would go up 1 to 3%. You know, we're probably talking about $1 to $3 a month. Now, you know who else has said in recent days, actually about a week ago, that you can close Indian Point? It's just a question of the trade-offs. It's just a question of what trade-offs you want to make. Jerry Nappy, who is the spokesman for Indian Point at Entergy, and you can go online as we sit here and Google Nappy and closure, and believe me, you'll find it. He said you can do this. This can be done. Anyone who says no, we can't, probably has a stake in keeping the plant open. I want to say this too. You know, the plant is half shut down today. They had to take one of those reactors offline because they were going to have a transformer explosion, which they had 2 of in recent years. If they didn't, they were going to have a 3rd one if they didn't take that plant offline. The lights are on. If it was the summer, the lights would be on. Can't get a plane into the containment structure? Well, actually, that's a matter of debate. But what you can do is you can get a plane into those spent fuel pools, and there isn't anybody here who could possibly tell you that you could not. And that's why the National Academy of Sciences warned us in 2005 that those spent fuel pools are vulnerable. And they're containing 5 times more radiation than either of those reactors. Striped bass, well, I'll tell you one of the reasons why the striped bass are on rebound. Because the PCBs in the striped bass have taken them out of the fishery. And, you know, you cannot say that a plant that impinges or entrains over 1 billion fish, eggs, and larvae a year doesn't have an impact on the fish populations. That just won't wash. 50-mile evacuation, there are those who say, you don't need it. You didn't need it then. That was the implication that I heard. Well, let me tell you, the village of Itate is now uninhabitable in Japan, and it is 45 miles from Fukushima. Contaminated green tea, beef, wheat, and rice has been found over 25 miles away. And children's urine tested in Tokyo found 3 times the safe limit of cesium-137. I think we have an issue beyond 10 miles in Fukushima. Here's the lesson of Fukushima. If anyone tells you it cannot happen here, they are practicing magical thinking. I'm going to end by quoting the TEPCO website, which I went to after the Fukushima accident, and it said that they are capable of withstanding even the largest natural disaster. People in New York are telling you it won't happen here. We won't have a tsunami. They're not going to tell you that we're not going to have a fire or an earthquake because they know they can't do that. Anyone who tells you it can't happen here, just remember, that's what the Japanese were told before Fukushima. Thank you.
Jerry and John, who would you like to go next?
I remember as a kid that I used to love all these old songs, and there was one called, it seems to me I've heard that song before. And, you know, it is a song that I hear all the time because once again, you whip up the emotions of the general public, you get them to be afraid. Some of the baseload questions that you should be asking is, what steps are being taken to make it safer? Not what time are we going to shut the plant down. When a plant spends hundreds of millions of dollars to keep it safe, passes inspection, there are resident inspections, as you know, as John pointed out, who live on the facility, you know, and I'm going to let him handle safety. But once again, the reason the debate gets polluted is because once again, it's the invocation of you've got to be afraid, you've got to be afraid, you've got to be afraid. Well, when there was a terrorist act in the subway system in Japan, which resulted in the death of 6 people, the cry that went up in New York was, should we consider shutting down the mass transit system in light of what happened in Japan? And everybody knew that that was a ridiculous conclusion. Ashok says, I want to make it clear, I want to disassociate myself from CO2, polluting your air more, and I want to disassociate myself from more costs. So on August 19, 2011, Ashok was on the Capitol television show. If you were to shut it down, how would you replace the power? As a direct quote. For the combination of the power and the new transmission, you could replace it. There would be a cost impact, and there would be a CO2 penalty, but it can be done. So what do you mean that can you do it and can you meet the needs? The trade-off for the public decision is what are the benefits or the perceived benefits of shutting it down against the cost of shutting it down? In terms of people paying more for electricity and higher CO2, the trade-off has to be made. So the answer is the people who don't want Indian Point to stay open will say now, oh, I don't want to be associated with higher consumer costs and higher CO2 and diminution of the air quality, but that's what they're going around saying to the general public outside this room, that there is a trade-off. And so are you getting all of the facts? No, you're not getting all of the facts. It's so much easier to take an issue like Indian Point and not say, where's the power going to come from? How are we going to support the needs of this community? We're rebuilding downtown Manhattan. We're going to rebuild that west side where the Javits Center is. We're doing things in all the 5 boroughs. You don't have to be blind to go to Long Island City and go to Lower Brooklyn and all these places where there's new development occurring on a massive scale. That needs more energy. We have to be alert to the fact that we need the energy, that we have to prepare for the future. It's not just a question of hitting the bullseye, getting 2,000 megawatts. We need more than 2,000 megawatts. So the answer is yes, we want it to be safe, but we want the opponents of Indian Point to be more realistic and more honest.
Just a couple of points. First of all, relative to the emergency planning zones, the 10-mile zone is for the evacuation of the public. That same new Reg 0396 notes that you have to deal with interdiction of the food supply out to a distance of 50 miles. And so it's no surprise that you had the contamination of the food in Japan, and that's an issue that has to be very carefully monitored in the Japanese accident and is being monitored. A second point that I'd like to make here is also in emergency planning, this is something that all governmental officials know they have a responsibility to do, and they do it. Sometimes it's done very well, other times it's not done well at all. As I mentioned, Mississauga is a good example of where it was done well. And also, very often, when we have the hurricanes coming in, as I think, as we know, when Irene came on New York City, we had to evacuate Lower Manhattan and also portions of Brooklyn because it was considered that they might be flooding in these areas, and it was done efficiently. The city was able to deal with it and dealt with it professionally and well. And so in most cases, this happens and is done properly. Even in many cases, as I pointed out, without detailed emergency plans. The Hudson River issue. Again, this is an issue which the state has stated that that Indian Point will have to build cooling towers to continue operations. I wonder how Scenic Hudson is going to approach 2 cooling towers, each the size of Yankee Stadium on the Indian Point site, if you have to build the cooling towers. That's going to be the next issue that will be addressed. The intervention in order to stop the building of cooling towers, which are being mandated in order to protect the river, and the people who want to protect the scenic view will also be mandating that you not build the cooling towers. It's another issue which puts you in kind of a bit of a quandary. One point that can also be made is that, yes, Indian Point could be replaced. Nobody's saying you can't replace it. It certainly will have to be replaced in 2035 if they get another 20 years. And also, the plants were designed originally for 60 years of operation, but it required that they be stopped at 40 years and the NRC review the plant conditions at that time and the safety of the plant and make a safety determination that they could go another 20 years. There are fossil plants that were operating in New York City that have been operating for operating for about 100 years. The old fossil boilers, you didn't have the same safety concerns on a device of that sort, obviously, but plants can be designed for long periods of time. The Indian Point plants have components that have broken and had to be replaced. When I was working there, we had to replace the steam generators because the condensers that are under vacuum, because they're condensing the steam from the turbine, drew Hudson River water into the condenser hot wells, and they were pumped, and the salts in the river went back into the steam generators and corroded the pipes in the steam generators, so that all of the steam generators in both of the plants were replaced. The turbines themselves have been replaced. The condensers have been retubed. This is something you do at plants all the time. It's preventive maintenance. You anticipate that something is going to get to the point where you have to replace it, and that's what you do. Those are investments that you make. None of these plants were designed to operate with nothing being replaced for 40 or 60 years. It's understood. That's why we have over 1,000 people working at a nuclear power plant, and your average fossil plant has less than 100 workers working in it. That's why the people who work at a nuclear plant, also in huge percentages of them, are licensed engineers who have been experts in the areas of corrosion, in the areas of mechanical engineering and so forth and so on, where they are constantly monitoring the plant conditions and replacing it. It was mentioned that the transformer recently, the plant had to shut down because of a problem with a transformer, not one of the big transformers like the ones that were mentioned earlier, but one of the smaller transformers inside the plant. It could not be replaced without shutting the plant down, and so that had to be done. One of the things that Entergy has done is brought a significant management technique into the plants in order to be able to get much more work done in a much more efficient manner. As a result, those plants operate about 90% of the time. Yes, they shut down. They have to be refueled, but that takes about 10% of the time. And also during those refuelings, thousands and thousands of maintenance jobs are done. The work has been pre-planned. The engineers are in place, the equipment is in place, the procedures are in place, the inspection programs are in place, and the NRC has their inspectors on site to make sure it gets done. And the quality assurance people are there also to make sure it's done right. And that work is done, and it is done efficiently and safely, and those plants are kept safe. And all of those engineers are there for a purpose, to maintain the safety of those plants and their reliability and their security for the protection of the people around them and the protection of their own families, because they all live in proximity to the plant. They don't want to have to commute very, very long to get to their jobs. I lived less than 4 miles away, as I said. Unfortunately, when I had to drive to the plant, I had to go up and over the Bear Mountain Bridge and back down again. But still, I was close to the plant, as close as I could get and afford. At that time, I really couldn't afford Westchester County. But fundamentally, the plants are safe. The workers are there to make sure it's safe. They are highly skilled, highly trained, and totally dedicated to the safety of you and themselves and their families.
Thank you. So anyone who has questions, please pass your cards to the people who are going to be walking up and down the aisles for them. And meanwhile, while they're being brought up to me, I'm going to ask a couple of questions. Ashok, I want to make sure I understand what your position is on replacement. You indicated that there's plenty of energy in the system to meet our energy needs. Are you saying that today there is enough energy in the system to meet our energy needs and still meet reliability standards?
The short answer is yes. I don't think we should not do anything. I think there are a lot of things we should do in order to mitigate costs and other impacts. But from pure reliability perspective, in terms of lights being kept on, the answer is yes. But again, that doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing lots of things in terms of improving reliability, minimizing costs, minimizing emissions. But because there is right now, and this is the ISO saying it.
And Paul, you indicated that we could bring in 1,000 megawatts from new transmission lines. What is the, where would that power come from?
Actually, 1,500 megawatts, not 1,000. 500 is already being built. It's coming in from plants in the Mid-Atlantic region. Another 1,000, I think, is envisioned where it would be 750 from Canada and 250 from upstate. A third project is proposed and is in the queue that would bring 1,000 megawatts or more, all in from New York State. That project, I imagine, is going to be going into the permitting process sometime soon. So that's the best answer I can give you. And I just want to say one thing quickly about carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide loading of wind, solar, hydro, and energy efficiency is actually less than nuclear because you don't have to mine the uranium or deal with it afterwards.
Let me ask John a question, if I may. Could the spent fuel storage areas at Indian Point withstand an airplane strike?
The pool is about 40 feet square. Now, there's also containment structures in large buildings all around the pool. I think in order for an airplane to be able to get into the spent fuel pool, you would have to, I can't imagine, I'm not a pilot, but I certainly don't know how you could aim a plane to hit a target 40 feet square between large other buildings. And so, theoretically, I suppose it's possible. However, I remember being at a public hearing many years ago in Rockland County when one of the interveners raised the question about whether an earthquake could cause a crack in the pool and drain the pool, and what would you be able to do in order to cool the pool water. At that time, the Union of Concerned Scientists had a scientist by the name of Bob, actually an engineer by the name of Bob Pollard, who was at that particular hearing. Oh, I'm sorry. At that time, the Union of Concerned Scientists had an engineer working for them by the name of Bob Pollard. And he said, it's not an issue. He said, all you need is a fire hose with a fog nozzle on it pushed over the edge of an empty pool, and that would be sufficient cooling to take care of the spent fuel. That's not coming from me. That was coming from an advocate to shut Indian Point, and that was what he had said at that particular point in time. So, yes, I think that it's theoretically feasible that an airplane or some other device could get there. Now, in terms of getting to the spent fuel pools, otherwise, they are well within highly protected, secure areas. We drill the people that, when I first started out I'll go back a little further. Back in the 1960s, I worked at a research reactor on a university campus during the uprisings against the Vietnam War, and at that time we had weapons-grade uranium in the fuel at the research reactor, and the only security we had was a retired police officer with a revolver. The world has changed. You essentially have an army of personnel who are highly trained in order to protect that facility with weapons that are designed to meet any and all possible assaults. That system is tested by the U.S. government, in which they bring in special forces people in order to simulate attacks on the site to make sure that the site can respond to all possible assaults. And it is constantly tested, it is constantly inspected, and so you have a very, very sound security system there to protect the spent fuel pool and all other safety aspects of the plant.
We have a question. Jerry indicated that there's also going to be economic growth in the city and more population and more power is going to be needed. Do your projections were about how much would be needed to replace Indian Point? How do you account for the added electricity generation capacity that would be needed in order to satisfy the growth needs of the city?
Yeah, no, I think the analysis I think Paul was pointing out, I mean, I think we said that in our study that if you looked at all of the options in terms of renewables, efficiency, natural gas, renewables, offshore, the transmission, that basically we want there to be as much additional capacity, now not 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 megawatts of additional resources, so we can actually keep not only meeting our demand growth, which we think efficiency, of course, is the best way to meet that demand growth, but also to replace existing dirtier generation. So we have a strong interest in having new resources added. And I would argue that for the next 10 to 15 years, we could meet all demand growth just through efficiency, easily. But we should keep adding more resources on the supply side to replace existing resources that are very old and aging and have impacts that we want to do away with. I think the McKinsey analysis shows the potential for efficiency and how much opportunity there is. So I think we shouldn't be thinking about new supply just for demand growth. We should be thinking of new supply to replace existing supply, and we should be thinking of energy efficiency to be able to meet the 1% to 2% demand growth quite easily.
Very quickly, the number I gave, which is the low-hanging fruit, was 4,800 megawatts. That's 2.4 times Indian Point. And another number I want to give you is 39%. That is the amount of reduction in energy demand that's projected to be achieved at the Empire State Building by their energy retrofit, 39%, and they have projected that that will pay for itself in 4 years.
There are a number of questions about nuclear waste in view of the cancellation of the Yucca Mountain project. How long is the nuclear waste going to have to stay at Indian Point, and will the facilities that are there now be able to handle it, or will that require a great deal of more construction?
As I think all of us know, back in, I believe it was 1979, Jimmy Carter signed an executive order which stopped all reprocessing of commercial nuclear fuel in the United States. Up until that point in time, actually, some of the spent fuel from Unit Number 1 had been reprocessed, although there was still spent fuel in the pools at Indian Point 1, which were an old design without a liner, and that's one of the reasons you had the leaks at the plant, which should have been anticipated because it was simply a concrete pool with seams in it, and you did have leakage through those seams, and that leakage did come from the Unit 1 pools. Entergy removed the spent fuel from those pools, decontaminated the pools, and that problem was stopped. But relative to the additional spent fuel issues, they ran out of room in the spent fuel pools I guess several years ago, and got permission to take the old spent fuel out of the pools and put them into dry casks and store them on site. They are being stored on site essentially on a concrete slab. This is being done at all of the reactors in the United States because the federal government in the U.S. has decided that we can't reprocess spent fuel. Fuel is being reprocessed in Europe. The decision has been made to proceed with spent fuel reprocessing. We are not doing it here. Yucca Mountain, as you pointed out, has been canceled. It was one of three sites that was considered by Congress. Nobody seems to be terribly interested in finding out what we want to do with this eventually, it's certainly a problem that this country should be facing. You have spent fuel being generated at operating power reactors, and there is no place to ultimately dispose of it. You have casks, I believe that originally they were licensed for 20 years. I believe the licensing has now been extended for 60 years for those casks. They are essentially passive devices, and they allow for air cooling through, and without any power necessary to make that cooling occur. But again, it's an issue where you could simply continue to take spent fuel out of the spent fuel pools and put them in dry casks and store them on site until the end of the plant life, and then the plant has to stay there with the spent fuel until ultimately a decision is made by the federal government on what we're going to do with spent fuel. And the federal government has not taken any action on that issue other than to cancel Yucca Mountain since 1979. It's something to write to your congressman about.
Several questions about the rate impact of shutting down Indian Point. Paul or Ashok, what do you think the electric rate impact would be?
Yeah, basically 1 to 3% is what our Synapse study showed. So if you have a $100 bill, it's $1 to $3 per month. So I think that's the range we estimated.
And so a follow-up question on that is, don't you recognize that many small businesses operate on tight margins and would suffer from 3% rate increases?
They won't necessarily. They won't necessarily. Energy efficiency could lead to a net reduction in bills. See, the problem here is the ones who want to keep it open have an interest in the plant staying open, some for good reasons, some for not so good reasons, and they're holding us back. We can save a lot of money through energy efficiency. We can reduce power costs through new transmission capacity. We can get ourselves into a sustainable energy future if we close Indian Point.
So is this the highest and best use of energy efficiency savings, or from a climate perspective, would the energy efficiency savings better be used by shutting down existing fossil generators like gas?
It's not an either-or. Remember, you can get 4,800 megawatts of power savings in various ways, and this is all in the Synapse report, and I urge you to go to the website, and you've got to realize that this has all been done elsewhere. This is not speculation. So you could use some of the energy efficiency savings to close Indian Point. You could use some of it to generate power for new growth. You could use some of it to shut down other plants. And remember, you can repower old, dirty power plants in the city and reduce air pollution and increase efficiency.
John, didn't the NRC state that the G forces released by the Virginia 5.0 earthquake were far more forceful than the design basis for northeastern power plants? That earthquake cracked buildings at the North Anna nuclear plant.
I believe the NRC said that the earthquake created a greater G-force than was originally considered at the North Anna plant. And yet the North Anna plant, although it shut down, was certainly not significantly damaged by that earthquake. There was damage to buildings in Washington, D.C. I guess the most well-known one was the Washington Monument. It was also felt in a larger area because of the rock structures that we have on the East Coast. This is one of the issues that was addressed in the recent reanalysis of seismic issues by EPRI, which is being implemented, which is being considered right now by the NRC for all plants in the central and eastern parts of the United States. The earthquake was also felt at Indian Point. It was monitored by the seismic monitoring equipment, but it was well within the allowable forces to continue to operate the plant. And so Indian Point did not shut down as a result of that earthquake, and but it was certainly measured and monitored at the plant. And in the NRC inspectors, you can be sure, looked very closely at the decision processes that were made when they first sensed the earthquake and determined that they should continue to operate, and the NRC concluded that the decisions were made in an appropriate manner. The Indian Point plants have been listed as green, that is the highest rating of safety for nuclear power plants by the NRC for the last 6 consecutive years.
What happens to the good-paying jobs at Indian Point? 1,000 people work at the plant, 12,000 plus indirectly working for the plant.
First of all, I want to say to the people who work at the plant who are here tonight that we don't say what we say lightly. I hope the way I've said what I've said and what I have said shows you that I'm not doing this lightly. Second of all, as I understand it, if Indian Point, like Maine Yankee, were to decommission promptly after closure, after ceasing generating power, there would be 8 to 15 years of good jobs, possibly just as many. If you have new jobs in energy efficiency, if Indian Point closes and we generate new jobs in energy efficiency, these are good-paying jobs that use American-made materials. So this is like many benefits for this country. But do we talk about this lightly? No. We just made a calculated determination that because of the risk and because of the age of the plant and because of the issues that I've talked about and because of the availability of other power, the availability of jobs during decommissioning and the availability of jobs from building transmission lines or energy efficiency, that this is a net good for everybody. But I don't take that lightly.
We have reached 8:30. I want to thank all of the speakers for a terrific and vigorous discussion. I want to thank all of you for being such a wonderful audience. Thank you.